Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to India-Bangladesh relations, as elections were held in Bangladesh which were won by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and Tariq Rahman is set to become the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and this is a chance for resetting the India-Bangladesh ties. The second article that we'll take up is related to United Nations Security Council, as the UNSC Sanctions Committee has observed the role of the Jaish in the Red Fort attack, which was earlier highlighted by India. Additionally, we'll take 5 articles in the prelims pointers which will be helpful for your prelims preparation. The first article is related to India-Bangladesh relations, as elections were held in Bangladesh which were won by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and Tariq Rahman is set to become the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. This presents India with a chance to reset the India-Bangladesh ties. Therefore, we'll discuss the evolution of India-Bangladesh ties with a reference to the relation with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the challenges that India faces in the bilateral relations, also the significance of Bangladesh for India, and the suggestions of the Parliamentary Standing Committee report regarding the India-Bangladesh relations. This is important in GS2 under the topic India and its neighborhood relations. Post the exit of Sheikh Hasina, particularly after August 2024, there was a turbulent phase in the India-Bangladesh relations. There were anti-India comments which were made even by the chief advisor of Bangladesh. Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh was even pushing for the establishment of an Islamic State in Bangladesh. Hizb ut-Tahrir there was openly recruiting the Indian educated youth also from Delhi, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, etc. to participate in the radical Islamic activities in Bangladesh. Hizb ut-Tahrir was openly conducting pro-caliphate rallies in Bangladesh right under the nose of the interim government there. And the Islamic radical activists, they were even escaping from the prison and sometimes released from the prison. So there were strong anti-India sentiments as well. Now, after the elections in Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party has come to power, and therefore India has a chance to reset the ties. So first, let us discuss the history of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. It was founded by Ziaur Rahman in 1978. He was Tariq Rahman's father, but he was assassinated shortly thereafter, and he was followed by Khalida Zia. But from 2001 onwards, India's relations with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party started turning bitter because they formed a coalition with Jamaat-e-Islami there. And Jamaat had the alleged involvement in the terrorist activities emanating from Bangladeshi soil and coming into India. This posed a security threat to India. Therefore, after 2008, there was a shift in India's approach. We aligned towards Sheikh Hasina because Sheikh Hasina was going for the counter-terrorism activities, and therefore she got support from India regarding the counter-terrorist activities. But Hasina was also using the crackdown on the terror to target her opponents, targeting the Bangladesh Nationalist Party also and targeting the leaders of Jamaat as well. And therefore there was a vacuum post the exit of Hasina in 2024 in the Bangladeshi politics. This vacuum in the Bangladeshi politics was filled by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party and the Jamaat-e-Islami there. Now, India's approach towards Bangladesh has shifted a little after the exit of Hasina. India has shown the intent to engage with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. For example, Prime Minister Modi congratulated Tariq Rahman even before the formal announcement of the election results. And therefore, India has shown the support towards a democratic, inclusive, progressive Bangladesh. This shows the official intent to engage with Bangladesh. Earlier also, we had gone for outreach towards Bangladesh Nationalist Party. For example, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar attended the funeral of Khalida Zia in December last year. And there has been a reciprocity from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party also, a conciliatory tone. They have refrained from commenting on India, critical comments, anti-India comments, and Rahman has also pledged that he will be supporting and protecting people from all religions. and there will be a zero tolerance towards anti-India activities. The manifesto of Bangladesh Nationalist Party implied that there will be non-interference and they won't be allowing anti-India activities from their soil. And simultaneously, there has been a conciliatory stance of the Jamaat-e-Islami as well, who has also pledged that they will engage peacefully with the neighbors including India. But there are a few challenges that India faces with respect to Bangladesh. The first challenge will be that Sheikh Hasina continues to reside in India, and if she is not extradited to Bangladesh, then the Bangladesh Nationalist Party chief will face criticism there, particularly from Jamaat, because Hasina was targeting her opponents when she was in power. The second challenge will be that Bangladesh is India's largest trading partner in South Asia, and we export pharmaceuticals, we import textiles, there is energy trade as well, and we need to continue the trade ties. The third challenge will be that the security situation, we do not want it to deteriorate in Bangladesh to the same levels that were there in the earlier BNP tenure. And we also want to continue our development and connectivity projects. New Delhi has invested in development projects in Bangladesh, connectivity projects, for example, Agartala Akhora rail link, the links with Assam, Meghalaya and Tripura to Sylhet and Dhaka for easier access. Also, we want to improve the people to people ties. The Bangladeshi people, they visit India for tourism, including medical tourism, and there is economic migration also from Bangladesh to India. There are a few other challenges with respect to India-Bangladesh relations. The most prominent one being regarding the border concerns. Because the border areas, there is radical Islamic activities. This region is exploited by the radical outfits and the criminal networks. For example, the spread of the Salafist activities. Salafism is a sect within Sunni Islam which is more orthodox in nature, which follows the earlier Islamic practices. And the Bangladeshi preachers, they give religious discourses in the West Bengal border districts, for example Malda, Murshidabad, North 24 Parganas districts, and there are ethnic and linguistic similarities in the region between the people of Bangladesh and West Bengal, and these similarities aid in the infiltration. This is exploited by the radicals there, and there is illegal migration also which happens from Bangladesh to India states, particularly the northeastern states, for example Assam, Tripura, etc. And there is also the spreading of extremist Bengali literature, especially on the social media, to spread propaganda, to spread hate against India, anti-India sentiments. And there is concern regarding the terror modules as well. The Jamaatul Mujahideen Bangladesh, the Ansarullah Bangla team, although their terror modules were neutralized, but they should not be revived. And even the Indian insurgent groups, for example, even the National Democratic Front of Bodoland, the ULFA, they set up camps in Bangladesh, seeking refuge there. Another challenge is with respect to the Rohingya refugees also. These refugees, they are victims of radicalization also sometimes. For example, 1.3 million in Bangladesh, they are also vulnerable to radicalization. And also the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army that recruits them for anti-India activities. It has links to the drug syndicates as well. And therefore, there are infiltration attempts into the northeastern states of India. There is another challenge with respect to the Chittagong Hill Tracts. This region is infested with ethnic conflicts, and therefore demographic changes happen because of the illegal immigration into India by the Bengali Muslims. And there is even a potential base for the Indian insurgent groups who set up their bases there. Another concern is with respect to the attacks on the minorities, the Hindu minorities in Bangladesh, which is although denied by the regime in Bangladesh. And there are challenges with respect to the increasing Pakistani footprints also there. For example, the strengthened ties between Pakistan and Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh. The Jamaat-e-Islami has secured a high number of seats, although they are in opposition in Bangladesh, but their vote share has increased. Also, the military and ISI delegations from Pakistan, they have visited even the sensitive border areas in Bangladesh, and they have resumed direct trade after 1971. The ISI is also aiding the terror modules there, including the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Pakistan promotes the Islamic identity, which we all know. Another challenge is with respect to the China angle as well, as Bangladesh has invited China in the past to revive the Lalmonirhat air base. And what if China starts deploying their fighter jets from Bangladesh from the Lalmonirhat air base? It will be a concern, a security threat for northeastern India and most probably for India's chicken neck corridor, the Siliguri corridor. And at times, India has also misread the maritime geography. India projects itself as the guardian of the ocean, but the ocean is also shared, and India is also vulnerable because of a large coastline, and therefore we need to guard our long coastline from the terrorist infiltrations. And there is the challenge of the sharing of transboundary river waters also. For example, the Ganga Water Treaty, which is set to expire in 2026, which needs to be renewed. Negotiations have to be finalized for that as well. Another challenge is with respect to smuggling and trafficking also, which is a major cause of concern because of trafficking as well as smuggling into West Bengal from Bangladesh. Now let's observe the significance of Bangladesh for India as well. Bangladesh is geostrategically important for India because it will ensure regional stability if the regime in Bangladesh supports India with respect to the counter-terrorism, with respect to the security initiative, with respect to the border management. And we also need support from them in the regional blocs, including the BIMSTEC, BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Indian Ocean Rim Association, etc. Bangladesh is also geopolitically significant for us for ensuring counterterrorism, border security, and also for India staking a claim as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. For getting a seat, we need one more vote, and Bangladesh can be that vote. And geoeconomically looking, again, Bangladesh is significant because we import textiles from there, we export pharmaceuticals. It is also a market for India, and it is a trade route. It is on the way for our trade towards Southeast Asia, because if Bangladesh allows easy connectivity through land, then it will be easier for trade between the mainland India to Southeast Asia through Bangladesh. And it is also India's fifth largest export destination as of 2022-2023 in South Asia. It is the biggest trade partner also. Bangladesh is our biggest trade partner in South Asia. With respect to connectivity, again we need Bangladesh. For example, the connectivity to the northeastern states, again the Agartala Akhora rail link. We have the protocol on the inland water trade and transit, which permits the movement of the goods vessels on the Bangladeshi rivers, the securing of the sea lanes of communication, the IB protocol route, which you can see in the map also, which has been in place since 1970s, through which the Indian vessels can also move through the Bangladeshi rivers. And there are defense cooperation also. For example, the exercises, the army exercises between Indian army and Bangladeshi army, Sampriti, the navy exercise, Bongo Sagar. And there are cultural ties also. For example, celebration of Durga festival both in Bangladesh and West Bengal, music, literature being common between Bangladesh and some of the Indian states as well. Now let's observe the suggestions of the Parliamentary Standing Committee report headed by Dr. Shashi Tharoor regarding the recommendations on the India-Bangladesh relations. First, regarding the strategic engagement, because the India-Bangladesh ties are significant from a strategic point of view. We need to engage diplomatically with all the stakeholders in Bangladesh. The persons in power as well as the opposition, all the civic society stakeholders as well. And we need to complement it with the track 2 and track 1.5 diplomacy. Complement the formal engagement with the track 2 diplomacy, track 1.5 diplomacy. For example, collaborations between think tanks, between academia, the civic society, media groups, etc. We can simultaneously leverage our soft power so that we are able to protect the minorities in Bangladesh as well. Regarding the stay of Sheikh Hasina in India, India can continue taking a principled stand, a humanitarian approach, and we also need to preserve our 1971 legacy. There are at times anti-India sentiments being spread in Bangladesh. We need to counter the emergence of such revisionist narratives because there is a diminishing awareness among the younger generation of Bangladesh, which is prone to radicalization. And simultaneously, we need to monitor the increasing Chinese influence in Bangladesh. For example, they have invested in Mongla Port, Lalmonirhat Air Base, Pekua Submarine Base. Please remember these names for prelims. And we can also leverage the BIMSTEC as well. We can give full diplomatic and technical support to Bangladesh during its chairmanship of BIMSTEC. We can also support Bangladesh in the implementing of the BIMSTEC master plan for transport connectivity, and it will be getting the support of the Asian Development Bank as well to ensure that there is better connectivity between India and Bangladesh, and in turn it will improve India's trade with the Southeast Asia as well. Regarding the economic ties, the committee recommended for the improving in the trade relations through improvement in infrastructure. Improving the infrastructure at border, for example, the integrated check posts, improving the logistics connectivity, rail, road connectivity, even air connectivity as well, and also ensuring digital trade. For example, giving online customs clearances. And the committee recommended the preventing of the dumping of Chinese goods in India through Bangladesh. Because China exports to Bangladesh, those goods are in turn exported to India, and more than 90% of the goods coming from Bangladesh, they enter into India duty free. Therefore, we need to ensure that there are stringent rules of origin verification mechanisms. If the origin is from China, then we should levy a duty upon that good if it is imported into India, even if it is coming through Bangladesh. And we should also expedite the conclusion of the comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Bangladesh. And we can also ensure that the development partnership is further strengthened. There are already partnerships, for example, the ongoing Dhaka Tongi Jodhpur railway line, also the evacuation railway lines constructed near the Rupur plant in Bangladesh. Regarding the security aspect, the Parliamentary Standing Committee observed that for the border, we need to complete the fencing as soon as possible. There are still areas where the border fencing has not been completed. We need to improve the coordination between the BSF and the BGB of the Bangladesh, the border guard of Bangladesh, and there can be continuous Director General level talks, establishment of joint task forces, and the modern surveillance mechanisms can be adopted. For example, motion sensors or thermal imaging cameras, night vision cameras. Also, India needs to ensure multi-agency coordination. The coordination between the central teams, the state teams, law enforcement agencies, and illegal migration also needs to be checked. For checking the illegal migration, there has to be a dedicated bilateral mechanism or the establishment of a joint working group between India and Bangladesh. Regarding the other issues, for example, Ganga Water Treaty renewal, the committee recommended that there has to be a renewal using the updated hydrological data, considering the climate change projections also, and we need to ensure that there is equitable utilization of water between India and Bangladesh, because the Ganga Water Treaty is set to expire in 2026 itself. And for this, there has to be consultation with the affected states in India as well, including West Bengal and Bihar. Regarding the cultural ties, you can suggest that we can hold more annual joint events. For example, the Tagore Nazrul Literary Festival. The ICCR can expand beyond Dhaka, setting up regional links also there. The Indian Council for Cultural Relations, we can expand the number of scholarships that we give to Bangladeshi students, the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation scholarships, etc. And regarding the protection of minorities, again we can collaborate with the Bangladeshi government so that there is stringent action taken when there is violence upon the minorities in Bangladesh. Now there is a mains practice question also. Discuss the significance of Bangladesh for India and examine the key challenges in the bilateral relations. Suggest measures to strengthen the partnership. Please try to write it. The next article is related to United Nations Security Council, as the UNSC Sanctions Committee has observed the role of Jaish in the terror attack in Red Fort in India. India had earlier highlighted the same. So we will discuss regarding the United Nations Security Council, the reforms needed in the UNSC, the debate around the veto power for the permanent members of the UNSC, and why India must also be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, as well as a few suggestions for the reforms in the UNSC. This is important in GS2 under the topic Important International Institutions, Agencies and Fora, their structure and mandate. First, let's start with a few facts regarding the United Nations Security Council. It was established in 1946. It comprises of 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent members who are elected for a period of 2 years. The goal of UNSC is to maintain peace and security across the world, and therefore it can recommend agreements between the countries, conduct investigations, perform mediation, dispatch a mission and appoint special envoys as well. It can give ceasefire directives. It can also send military observers or a peacekeeping force as well. And for the enforcement measures, it can impose economic sanctions, impose arms embargoes, it can impose travel bans also, it can recommend the severance of diplomatic relations and even impose a blockade upon the country. The decisions that are taken by the UNSC that the member states are obligated to implement. Now, regarding the reform in the United Nations Security Council, the criteria for reform is that 2/3 of the members, the UN member states voting in the General Assembly, have to agree with it. Plus, they have to ratify this, and there has to be a consent of all the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Now, what is the need for reforming the United Nations Security Council? First, the usage of the vetoes by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council has been for their own interest, not for the world stability and peace. For example, the veto power uses regarding the Gaza ceasefire by USA, the vetoing of the Ukraine ending of the military conflict by Russia. Therefore, it has to be more responsible and it has to be more responsive as well. For example, if the P5 countries do not have any interest regarding a conflict in a region, then they do not pass any resolution. For example, the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, the P5 nations had little interest. If an African country was a member of the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, they would have fought for it. And more than 80,000 people lost their lives at that time, the Hutu and Tutsi people there, those lives could have been saved. Similarly, should a country get a seat for life as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? Because power is not constant in the international relations. Great Britain, France, they lost their large empires after the decolonization post the World War II. Similarly, the reforms have been long overdue. For example, the United Nations Security Council that has expanded only once to include 4 more non-permanent members in 1963, whereas the United Nations General Assembly that has expanded from 113 countries to 193 countries. Also, the geopolitical realities, they have changed. They are not like the World War II era or the post-World War II era. There has to be better economic representation as well as geographic representation. For example, the representation needed for the G4 countries or the representation to countries from all the continents across the world. And for better legitimacy, better credibility, it has to be reformed. For example, in the name of responsibility, it has conducted interventions in Libya and Syria which are questionable. Similarly, the north-south divide also has to be bridged. The P5 nations, they are broadly representing the global north. Also, there are emerging issues, for example, economic interdependence, climate change mitigation, which need to be addressed by an organization like the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, it needs to be reformed. Now let's observe the debate regarding the veto power for the P5 members of the UNSC. Should they be having the veto power? First, the arguments against the veto power for the P5 members. The concept of veto violates sovereign equality because the UN Charter mentions that all member states are equal. If all are equal, then how can only a few members have veto? And it is undemocratic in nature because a veto by a single member of the P5 countries of the UNSC can overturn the decision of a majority within the United Nations Security Council, and therefore it paralyzes the functioning of the council, and it is at times abused for the national interest by the P5 members. The vetoes are not for the world stability rather for their own interest, and at times they even block the actions on mass atrocities, for example Rwanda, Syria, etc. And this concept of veto, it is now outdated. The P5 structure represented the power structure of the post-World War II era. The winners of the World War II, they were given this like a safety valve, like a trump card in their favor, so that they are participating actively in such a forum to ensure the stability and peace across the world. Now the power structure have changed. For example, the fall of the empires of Britain and France, and there is simultaneously a lack of accountability as well. For example, there is a hidden veto as well as a double veto. Hidden veto, for example, the P5 nations, they threaten the use of veto of a proposal, stifling the introduction of a proposal itself in the UNSC. And the double veto means, first the P5 members, they can classify an issue as a procedural issue, and therefore then subsequently give another veto even for the substantive matter as well. The French therefore came up with a proposal that the veto should not be there for the mass atrocities, mass crimes. Now let's observe the arguments in favor of the veto of the UNSC members, P5 members. First, the veto power ensures that the great powers, they are going for cooperation. Without their cooperation, the decisions implementation may be difficult, and it is preventing a major conflict, because a dissident great power may be provoked to enter into a conflict triggering a world war, which is prevented by the veto power. And there is a historical rationale also to ensure that the major powers, they are effectively participating in the processes for ensuring world security, and therefore it maintains the engagement of the P5 nations. Now, why should India be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? Because India is now a major global power. India is no more a land of snake charmers. India represents the world's largest democracy. India represents 1/6 of the humanity on earth, and it is also a major economic power. Soon we will be the third largest economy also in the world. We are a proven contributor to the United Nations. We contribute a large number of peacekeeping missions, the Green Berets, and we have an active global engagement also across issues. For example, promoting the reforms in institutions including WTO, the World Bank, IMF, or the engagements regarding climate change, etc. And we have been the voice for the global south, therefore effectively bridging the gap, the connectivity gap, the communication gap between the global north and the global south. And we have been a promoter of peace. For example, we have policies like nuclear doctrine, no first use policy, Article 51 promoting settlement of international disputes through mediation, peaceably through amicable resolution of the disputes, etc. And we have international support also. For example, the backing of the G4 grouping, the backing of 4 members out of the P5 members of the United Nations Security Council except China. And we have been a founding member of the United Nations Security Council, and this will represent the modern reality also, because India represents a large population as well as economic power too now. Now, what suggestions can we give regarding the reforms in the United Nations Security Council? First, there has to be a moderate expansion, because expanding the United Nations Security Council too much will be counterproductive, because it may lead to the delayed decision making of the UNSC. Therefore, a moderate expansion may be a good idea. Therefore, maybe 10 permanent members should be there in the UNSC, which will be distributed to 5 regional blocks in the United Nations, 2 each for each continent. And the eligibility criteria can be defined for the permanent members of the UNSC. For example, for the global north, it can be on the basis of their military might or their contribution to the United Nations budget. And for the global south, it can be in the form of their population, so that the larger portion of humanity is represented, their interests are protected, or their contributions to the peacekeeping missions, because the global south can contribute the boots on the ground and the global north can contribute the money. And there should be a restricted scope of veto. For example, the French proposal that vetoes should not be used for the proposals regarding the mass crimes, mass atrocities. We can follow the text-based negotiations, they should be revived, and the alternate multilateral fora can also be explored, for example, G20, BRICS. Now there is a means practice question also. The legitimacy and effectiveness of the United Nations Security Council are increasingly questioned in the changing global order. Discuss the need for reforms in the UNSC and justify India's claim for permanent membership. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the lifting of the ban on the wheat exports from India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding wheat in India and the export ban on wheat from India. Wheat is the staple food in India, second staple food after rice in India, and two-thirds of our population, about 65% of our population consumes wheat. And we are the second largest producer of wheat after China, the largest producer being China. There are two types of wheat which are grown in India, the bread wheat and the durum wheat. The bread wheat is grown over 95% of the cropped area in India, and it is suitable for making chapatis or rotis. And the durum wheat is suitable for making macaroni, noodles, pasta, etc. And it is grown over about 5% of the cropped area in India. Climate wise, wheat is grown as a rabi crop in India, and it requires sufficient sunshine at the time of its ripening, and it requires 50 to 75 centimeters of annual rainfall, which should be fairly well spread during its growth season. The significant growing regions with respect to wheat in India are the Ganga Satluj plains in the northwest India, the black soil region in the Deccan. The major producing states are Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, and parts of Madhya Pradesh. You can observe the significant wheat growing areas in the map as well in India. But why was the export of wheat from India banned? Because in 2022 there was inflation in India. The retail inflation touched 7.8% in April 2022. Similarly, the food inflation was high at around 8.4%. The wheat inflation was even higher at around 9.6%. Therefore, if wheat was allowed to be exported, the availability of wheat in India would have come down. At that time, there was a global food grain shortage also because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And if wheat was exported from India, the supply in India would have come down. The demand was the same. Because of the supply-demand mismatch, the inflation in wheat would have gone high, and therefore the domestic food security would have been a challenge. To protect the food security in India, therefore, the government imposed a ban on the wheat exports because the output of wheat in that year also declined in India, the production declined. You can observe from the graph that in 2021-2022, the production of wheat in India declined. Now, because there was a global food grain shortage, the private stockists in India, they procured wheat from the market. They wanted to export to the global markets, and therefore the private procurement went up. This led to the open market prices being higher than even the minimum support prices. The MSP prices were lower than the open market prices, which led to lower procurement by the Food Corporation of India. The FCI procurement came down. You can observe in the year 2022. Therefore, the buffer stocks also came down. So to ensure therefore the sufficient availability of wheat in India, the wheat export was banned from India in 2022. Now that ban has been lifted. There were certain concerns with respect to the export ban on wheat in India. For example, there was a policy uncertainty. In May 2022, initially, India had sent delegations to countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Morocco to export wheat, to explore the exporting of wheat from India. But then the inflation data came in, and therefore, subsequently, the Indian government banned the export of wheat from India. And this led to a loss of income also for the Indian wheat traders. The Indian wheat traders who were going to export the wheat that they had procured from the open market, their income was lost. And simultaneously, but the availability of wheat was ensured. The availability of wheat for schemes, for example, the PDS scheme, etc. And this led to a criticism from the other countries because India imposed a ban on the wheat exports at a time when there was a global food grain shortage. Therefore, the agriculture ministers of the G7 countries, they criticized India for shying away from taking up the global responsibility to ensure that there is no global food shortage. Now coming to the article, now India has allowed the export of 25 lakh metric tons of wheat along with an additional 5 lakh metric tons of wheat products, moving to lift the ban on shipment of the cereal that it imposed in May 2022. Now the wheat stock availability with the private entities during 25-26 stands at approximately 75 lakh metric tons, which is nearly 32 lakh metric tons higher compared to the corresponding period last year. This substantial year-on-year increase therefore indicates that there is a comfortable supply position. And also on 1st April 2026, the total wheat availability in the central pool with FCI is projected to be around 182 lakh metric tons, which will ensure sufficient food security in India. Therefore, India has lifted the export ban on wheat. The next article is related to oil pricing, as the prices of petrol and diesel have remained almost frozen, whereas the prices of crude oil have come down significantly. This is important in GS3 under the topic infrastructure energy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the fuel pricing mechanism in India. The petrol prices were deregulated in India in 2010, and the diesel prices, they were deregulated in 2014. That is, the government will not be fixing the price. Then if the government does not fix the price, who will? The oil marketing companies, OMCs, determine the prices. The OMCs determine the prices not based upon the actual costs that they incur. The actual costs that they incur are the crude oil cost, refining cost, marketing cost. But the price of petrol and diesel, it is determined on the basis of a formula, the trade parity price. As per the trade parity price formula, it is assumed that 80% of petrol and diesel is imported and 20% is exported. So the petrol price is based upon the price of the petrol in the international market. The petrol and diesel prices, they are based upon the prices of petrol and diesel in the international market, not the prices of crude oil in the international market. The international petrol and diesel prices, they generally move similar to the crude oil prices internationally, but sometimes they do not move in the same direction because of the demand supply dynamics. From June 2017 onwards, the daily pricing mechanism was adopted. That is, prices will be determined daily based on a 15-day rolling average international rate. But if you observe the petrol and diesel prices, they are different in different states, because apart from the trade parity price, there are three other factors which impact the prices. One is the excise duty charged by the central government, another is the value added tax, the VAT, which is charged by the states, and it varies from state to state, and also the dealer commissions which are given to the gas stations. Now there are certain limitations also on the tax reduction on the petrol and diesel. For example, if the tax is reduced on it, it will contribute to the widening of the fiscal deficit, because even if 1 rupee cut is given in the petrol and diesel price, it leads to a huge loss to the exchequer, to about 25,000 crores per year loss. And it will affect the economic development because it will bring the revenues for the government down. The reduction in the revenues will lead to the curtailment of the planned expenditure, therefore, and the outlay, the financial outlay for infrastructure and the healthcare sectors will also be affected. And the Indian actions have been under the watch from the global credit rating agencies also. They call the tax reduction regarding the taxes on the petrol and diesel as credit negative, because it leads to the widening of the fiscal deficit, and therefore it may lead to a sovereign ratings downgrade, and the sovereign ratings downgrade will lead to the outflow of the foreign capital. Therefore, the tax reduction on the petrol and diesel has not happened. Now coming to the article, the price of petrol sold in India has reduced just 1.9% since June 2022, although the price of crude oil has fallen 41.5% since then. The price of oil as captured by the Indian basket of crude oil rose to over $100 per barrel in the period from March to July 2022, soon after Russia invaded Ukraine. And you can observe from the graph also that the petrol price has remained almost constant, whereas the crude oil price has been coming down since 2022. And the oil marketing companies, when the crude oil prices went up, they increased the price of petrol to even 105 rupees per liter in April 2022. However, they later on froze it to 96 rupees per liter in May 2022, but they have been kept unchanged for more than 21 months thereafter until mid-March 2024. This freeze, however, marked an unofficial digression from the official dynamic pricing policy that was adopted in 2017 that we discussed, and the setting of the fuel prices as per the observations of the government, it is the exclusive domain of the oil marketing companies and the government has no part to play in this, but the pricing has been based upon convenience. The oil marketing companies in the past, whenever the crude oil prices are hiked, they pass on the hike to the consumers, they pass on in the form of the higher petrol prices. But when the crude oil prices have come down, they have not passed on the benefit of the falling oil price to the consumers. In a regulated system, whereas if the prices were not deregulated, then the consumer would have been insulated from both kinds of these shocks. Even the 1.9% reduction in the petrol prices since June 2022, that has been due to the cuts in the taxes on fuel rather than the actions by the oil marketing companies to reduce the price of petrol. The next article is related to the US actions with respect to Iran. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. First, let's observe how Venezuela will be different from Iran with respect to US's approach. Because Iran has a larger geopolitical significance, it has larger oil reserves, it has third largest oil reserves in the world, and it also has a sweeter oil and it can be extracted using the conventional techniques at a lower cost. It also has large natural gas reserves, second largest in the world. Even its production capacity was huge. In the pre-war era, it was more than 6 million barrels per day. And it even has a civilizational consciousness that the Iranians, they are proud. And there has been a resilience of the Iranian regime also that we have witnessed recently. For example, there has been a unity that has been displayed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the state has also shown the capacity for suppression of dissent, and also the information blackout that it imposed to curb the protests in Iran. There has been a significant support base also in support of the regime there. About 20% of their population, about 90 million population of Iran, out of that 20% people defend the regime there, and the opposition is also fragmented. For example, there is no credible alternative, and the former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is definitely not a credible alternative to the regime in Iran. So if the USA attacks Iran, what are the likely outcomes? First, there can be a rallying of the people around the flag. That is, the people may be defending the regime because the foreign attacks in the past recently, they have boosted the patriotism in Iran, and it may lead to the survival of the regime rather. And even if the regime does not survive, there can be worse outcomes. For example, what if Iran is then run by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps there, or there is a power vacuum in Iran that may lead to Iran devolving into a civil war, which will again be a mess in West Asia. Now, what has been the objective of Trump in Iran? The core demand has been the abandonment of the nuclear enrichment program, also the curtailment of the ballistic missile production by Iran, and at the same time, the end of the support for the non-state actors. That Iran should not support the Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in the other countries, and also cease being a revolutionary state. But if we look at the geopolitical and economic goals of USA, there has been a primary goal that US has to secure US primacy. The primacy regarding the oil dominance, global oil dominance. First they conquered Venezuela, and now they want the oil dominance in the West Asia as well. And they want also to counter China. China has been the largest buyer of the Iranian oil, the largest trading partner of Iran, and it has bought more than 1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian oil despite the sanctions imposed upon them. And they also want the access for the US companies in Iran. They want the US companies to invest in the Iran's petroleum industry, which needs huge investments for its further development and increase in production capacity, and therefore they also want to open up new markets for USA. And a stable Iran will provide new market for the export of the US goods and services into West Asia. And simultaneously, Iran has also been vulnerable. For example, the domestic instability and the protests that we have seen, the recent nationwide protests, the subsequent crackdown by the regime upon them, and the economic grievances also. For example, the sparking of the devaluation of the rial, and the regime has also witnessed strategic failures. For example, it suffered the military defeat at the hands of Israel. It was not able to protect its allies, like the protection it was not able to give to Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And also, there has been a waste of expenditure, strategic waste that some people view in Iran. For example, it has invested billions on the foreign activities supporting to the foreign groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., and also the uranium enrichment. This has led to a huge opportunity cost for Iran. They have invested billions, and in turn, what they got? Sanctions and international isolation. Therefore, the opportunity cost for these were high. So, what options does Trump have finally? One, the Venezuela model, that they strike a deal with somebody in the opposition or with somebody within the regime. For example, probably within the Iranian Revolution Guard Corps itself, to somehow remove Khamenei, because it is virtually impossible to kill Khamenei. And the option two will be going for economic strangulation. For example, imposing a blockade, maritime blockade, to halt the oil exports from Iran, because Iranian economy, it is significantly dependent upon the oil exports from Iran. So what will be its impact? The impact on India also, therefore, the impact on the oil and gas markets. First, there will be price fluctuations of the crude oil as well as natural gas, and India imports a significant amount of both. And there can be a Strait of Hormuz blockade also. If Iran is attacked, it may try to block the Strait of Hormuz. That will stop 20% of the world's oil and LNG flow, liquefied natural gas flow. And there can be some mitigating factors also, although, to mitigate the ripple effect with respect to the oil and natural gas supply, that will come from the OPEC, because the OPEC has ample surplus production capacity, about 3 to 4 million barrels per day, and new LNG projects, they are coming online in the US also and elsewhere as well. The next article is related to the use of AI in jobs and governance. This is important in GS2 under the topic e-governance, applications, models, successes, limitations, and potential. The article is based upon an interview with the Secretary for the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. First, let's observe the AI from an Indian perspective. We are focusing upon three infrastructure related pillars of AI, that is building compute capabilities, datasets and models, ensuring that we have enough GPUs and building large language models. We are focusing upon the impactful applications, the development of AI inspired solutions which can be deployed in India, and deployment will be the key for the revenue of the firms, the AI firms in India, and the focus will be on the Indian use cases plus the use cases which have the export potential. Therefore, we have adopted a frugal innovation model where the companies are resource conscious, and this approach is appreciated by the poorer countries. And hence, in the global rankings, we have secured high ranks. For example, the third rank on the vibrancy index, second in the skill penetration and use of AI for enterprise solutions, and therefore it might affect the job market dynamics. As per the Niti Aayog's study, there might be a loss of few basic IT jobs, the jobs related to basic coding and programming, but the AI will also create jobs in other areas, other sectors as well. Regarding the regulation of AI in India, we are leveraging the existing laws as per the Principal Scientific Advisors report on the AI governance guidelines. For example, the IT Act, Copyright Law, and the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023. Also, the labeling for the AI generated content is being mandated now. The rationale behind the labeling is that the citizens, they have the fundamental right to know that this content is generated using AI, this is synthetic content, And the feasibility of labeling is easy because technologically it is easy to implement, and there are specific exemptions also. For example, if the AI is used regarding the smartphone camera auto enhancements or special effects are used in films, then the labeling is not required. Regarding the takedown time, also the timeline has been brought down. The original longer timelines were given to the intermediaries, the past intermediaries, as they were having slower response capabilities. Now the capability of the media to go viral is high, and therefore the damage can be done within 24 hours. So the new rules, they provide that the takedown timeline will be within 2 to 3 hours for all kinds of content. Regarding the electronics manufacturing also, India is focusing upon, because there is the era of weaponized supply chain. We used to produce electronics until late 1990s. Then the IT agreement of 1997 led to the increase in the imports of the electronics hardware in India. The IT revolution was enabled by the access to this hardware which was imported into India. But today, if we observe the global value chain reality, it is not possible to produce all the electronic hardware in India. So therefore, we have begun with the finished product assemblies. For example, the assembly of iPhones in India. The current value addition in India is about 18 to 20% in the electronic value chain, as there are imported components also. The electronics component manufacturing scheme aims that the value addition in India with respect to the electronics hardware should increase to 35 to 40%, because China has around 40 to 50% of value addition. Regarding semiconductors, it is our strategic goal. So the focus will be on capability, not just value addition. For that, we have adopted a strategy, bite what we can chew. That is, focus will be initially on high volume, non leading edge segments. Organically, we will grow into more leading edge segments. Therefore, long term government support has been provided for that at least a decade, hence the India Semiconductor Mission 2.0. Next, regarding the IT firms business models, they are built on the labor arbitrage, and that can be threatened. So here the job displacement can be real. There will be loss of some jobs, including the basic coding, programming jobs, etc., which can be done by the AI bots. But there will be new jobs creation also. For example, the creating of tailored applications and solutions requiring domain expertise, deployment of these applications, examples in agriculture, manufacturing sectors, etc. And the government therefore also has launched a retraining program, because the workforce which will lose their jobs, that will need retraining so that they are able to get new jobs, like the future skills prime. And teaching of AI will be promoted like a horizontal technology, teaching AI in all the college courses rather than teaching it as a specific course. Now the AI will also be a power hungry sector with water as well as electricity needs. For that, we have sufficient grid capacity. There is high renewable energy deployment also, and the surplus renewable power that can be utilized by the data centers. Although there has been no relaxation in the environmental norms for the data centers, and they will be having server cooling options. Both are used in India, air cooled and water cooled, but they don't have other relaxations apart from limited building norm relaxations for the data centers. The next article is related to the US deal and India's concerns with respect to it. This is important in GS2 under the topic bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interests. There has been no final agreement yet. The deal as of now, it is only an interim framework for an interim agreement on reciprocal trade. But the procedural template itself is a cause of concern, as all the announcements they have made unilaterally by the US, and the Trump's post has even claimed specific concessions, whereas the subsequent post by Prime Minister Modi, it only mentioned tariff reductions. So what are the concessions that have been made by India? First, regarding the Russian oil imports, that we have already been reducing since November 2025. Russia's share has decreased from 40% in 2024 to 25%, while the discounts on the Russian oil, they have become even larger. Regarding the tariffs and trade also, we have given concessions. For example, the tariff and non-tariff barriers have been effectively brought to zero in return for 18% US tariffs on Indian goods, and India has committed to buy much more US oil. We have committed to buy American pledge by saying that about $500 billion of US goods and services will be bought by India, and the US order has even mentioned that India has agreed to align sufficiently with the US on national security, foreign policy, and economic matters. Therefore, there are certain unanswered questions. For example, India has not officially denied any of Trump's claims. The official statements, they have rather focused upon India's energy sourcing priorities and diversification, and buying of $500 billion of US goods that will leave limited space for the imports from the other countries. And also, the terms, the benefits that we have given to US, they have not been extended to the recently signed free trade agreements. For example, European Union, New Zealand, what if they start asking questions? So it may cause strategic and diplomatic repercussions. For example, the strategic autonomy may be affected. In 2019, India almost complied on giving up the Iranian oil and Venezuelan oil after the initial resistance. We can see a similar template unfolding now, because US is pushing India to buy American oil or Venezuelan oil, which is effectively controlled by America, to give up the Chabahar port project to end the trade with Iran. And if India yields, then it is narrowing India's options rather than diversifying them. Similarly, India's credibility and global standing may be affected. For example, we have the respect, the goodwill with Russia and Iran, and it will become an awkward moment for India, as India will also be hosting the 2026 BRICS summit. And there has been a pattern of US demands. For example, they have given limited regard for India's interests with the deals involving Pakistan or Bangladesh. Rather, they have insisted on ending the ties with Iran and Russia. And India was singled out as the only country which was imposed upon with 25% punitive tariffs for buying Russian oil. There are other major buyers also, example China, Turkey, and they were not targeted. Therefore, the core question remains that in 2022, when India did not criticize Russia when it went for the conflict in Ukraine, that time it was said to be pragmatism over principle. But in 2026, if we are giving up Russian oil as a compulsion of ties with US, it may not be either principled or pragmatic as per the observations of the author. And therefore, if we end up accepting unfair, unjustified, or unreasonable measures, then we might be having strategic repercussions in future also. Thank you.